Hi, I'm Jennifer Illuzi. I am an associate professor of history at Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island, in the United States. And my research is on the Romani population in Germany and Italy.
Wow. Okay. No, thank you obviously so much for making the time to be here today. I really appreciate it. Before we dive into the area of discussion and your research topic, I just want to ask a little bit more about yourself and how you ended up in this area of research and what was it that led you to do this? I know that's a hell of a lot to encapsulate in one question, but kind of yeah, how did you kind of go from I don't know whatever it was you were doing to focusing on this?
So in graduate school, I started out studying German history and mostly the history of the Jewish diaspora in Germany. And I ended up deciding I was also going to start studying Italy. So I got some grant money to go and take intensive Italian lessons in Florence. And when I was there, I noticed when I was out walking around that people would treat people that they called gypsies, zingari, in just these ways that astonished me. Um, Complaining about them, physical violence, warnings to me that gypsies would steal my things. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, this is incredible. And this level of racism is not something that I think for most other groups. I mean, there are other groups that are targets of racism, obviously, in Italy, but it just really struck me. And so I started asking myself questions about how did this happen, right? I'm a historian, so there's always a background, there's always a story behind what I'm seeing in front of me. And that's got me really interested in the interaction between this group of people who are labeled as Zingari in Italy and state authorities, church authorities, different institutions, and how they interact with this group, and how that's created a situation of this intense racism that's present to this day.
Yeah, no, just even from what you were saying, even in the UK, what I guess people here call gypsies are there's all sorts of stereotypes and racism aimed towards them. So, although not necessarily to the degrees with which you've shared, which is really interesting to see how actually it's across the map in Europe. Um, Before we dive into it a little bit more, just for those listening, what like who are the Romanian, who are the Gypsy, who are these people? Because I think for a lot of people, those terms mean lots of different things, and just to kind of paint a picture of who we're talking about and how this group of people have been marginalized before the point, I guess, at which we will discuss.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's a long history of a Romani diaspora in Europe. They arrive as early as the 15th century, and they spread across the continent. Of course, there is a longer historical connection, and a lot of anthropological research and linguistic research has postulated that the Romani people initially emigrated out of India, um, and then made their way to kind of Central Europe, Western Europe over time. And it's interesting. I mean, you talked a lot about the terms and the different terms. So there's this pejorative way that they're often come to people come to know them in Western Europe. And
Yeah.
there's different pejorative terms in different countries, depending on the language. And those terms often refer to a large group of people that either get labeled like gypsies or Zingari. In Germany, it's Zigeuner. They get labeled with this particular label, not necessarily always because of ethnic connections, right? But if someone is a criminal or they travel for work, they might get placed into this category. But then, of course, there is a whole category of folks of ethnic traditions that live throughout Europe, and different Romani groups live in different places. So, for instance, in France, there's the Manouche. In Germany, you have Sinti. You also have some northern Italian Sinti. You have the Rome, who are usually further east. There's Calderash. So there's a multitude of ethnic groups with different linguistic traditions, different traditions in terms of uh, their professions, horse trading, coppersmithing, historically speaking. So there's a rich diversity of ethnic traditions, and they're grouped. You can kind of group them under this heading of Romani people because they have common linguistic roots, some common cultural traditions, and perhaps similar historical origins. But there is a variety of these groups. So there's some, at least in my perspective, there's some value in talking about the ethnic group, or the ethnic groupings, but also there's this catch-all derogatory term in most places that institutions use to label and control these particular groups of people who most of them would ethnically identify as Romani, but some people get thrown in that category for other reasons.
Okay, no, that makes a lot of sense. No, thank you. Just in obviously focusing on the area of your research, and I think those coming from Britain, like I did history GCSE and history A level, and you learn about the Second World War uh, just constantly. And in terms of the Holocaust and the genocide that takes place during World War II, it's very much focused on what happened to the Jewish population in Europe. And there is a little bit of time focused on the disabled, the gypsies, the homosexuals, and other categories of people who were also victims of this genocide. What were some of I guess, what was the climate in Europe or in Germany prior to this turn of events that almost allowed this to kind of come to fruition? Almost like, what was the petri dish at this time kind of like? Because I think once you put it into context of what Europe had been doing for so long, it then doesn't seem so much out of place as it does, I think, when we're taught it at school.
Absolutely. I think most countries in Europe had policies in place by the interwar period that controlled the movement of Romani populations and that were often extremely oppressive in nature. Um, there was this idea that Romani people were all itinerant, which by the interwar period is not completely, actually not true at all, really. There's certainly a few groups who are still traveling regularly, but often even when they're traveling, they're like a contemporary business traveler, right? They're going to the same places at the same time every year, and they have a house and they have, somewhere that they live, a home base. Um, and so, but most countries, so for example, in Germany, you have very restrictive laws, oftentimes stripping Romani people of their claims to citizenship, expelling them over the borders of Germany. And the idea being that the tougher we are on these people, right, they won't want to be here anymore. So they'll just up and leave. Except, right, that assumes that Germany's not their home and they haven't spent their whole lives there. Same case with Italy. There's a slight difference in the sense that Italy never formally acknowledges that there are any zingari of Italian descent. That if you find someone who is a gypsy, they automatically are foreign and we must expel them. In Germany, there's a few places where there's an acknowledgement of Zigeuner with rights to German statehood, but over time it becomes more and more difficult to attain citizenship and to retain citizenship if you're a Romani citizen in Germany. Whereas in Italy, there's just sort of the automatic idea of expulsion. By the 1920s and 1930s in Italy, there's a little bit of an acknowledgement that there are folks with claims to Italian citizenship who are Romani. And in other places in Europe, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there's a long history of forced assimilation policies. Somewhat also in certain regions in Germany, there's a famous colony of German Romani at Friedrichsloh that are forcibly, or there's an attempt to forcibly assimilate them to German society. So there's kind of this mix of coercion, forced assimilation, and expulsion. France has a system of carnet, it's called the carnet anthropométrique, where nomads are tracked through administrative authorities. Their claims to citizenship in France are often challenged as well. So there's a vast network in it, and it differs from place to place how these populations are controlled and labeled, and their claims to citizenship. But there's not anywhere where I'd say it's a great outlook.
In relation to what takes place in Germany, obviously, again, coming, and this is just because of, I guess, my ignorance in this area and what we were taught at school, which is in the persecution of the Jews, there was events like Kristallnacht and then the Nuremberg laws, and there was like a slow, or how we were taught, there was an escalation of events that finally led to the Holocaust. With the Romani, what were the kind of steps, or what, like, how did that process of the genocide against them take place? And for argument's sake, I remember from what we were taught at school that uh, people with disabilities were almost the testing group before they then took what they learned from that and applied it to the Jewish community. Where does this community, unfortunately, in this situation, fit into the wider picture?
In fact, in Germany, the crackdown on Romani populations under Nazism begins even earlier than some of the like Kristallnacht in Germany. So in 1935, leading up to the Berlin Olympics, gypsies begin to be interned in camps. Different places around Germany are creating kind of internment camps in the either inside their cities or on the periphery of the cities, where they're oftentimes detaining German Romani populations. Many of these folks, for instance, had served in the Wehrmacht. They had done their army service. They had done their service. Their kids were attending German schools, and so even earlier than the loss of citizenship rights for Jewish folks under various laws, the Romani are experiencing the same kinds of exclusion and the same kinds of limitations on their movement. Berlin, before the Olympics, all of the Romani folks were taken out of the city, interned, not supposed to be seen publicly. So this suffering really begins relatively early. Of course, it's part of, as I just mentioned, a longer tradition of controlling, arresting, criminalizing Romani populations. So it's less noticeable, honestly, I think, for folks than perhaps the extremism of something like Kristallnacht, where all of a sudden you see that things are turning for the Jews in Germany. People were used to Romani people being arrested, persecuted and prosecuted in courts of law. It wasn't anything that was particularly new. And of course, that intensifies over the course of the war. Many Roma and Sinti throughout Europe are eventually sent to concentration camps. They either die from disease or they die in the camps, like in Auschwitz. And there's also, like with the Jews, there's a number of Romani people who are just shot in depending on local authorities, depending on their zeal for racial purity and their zeal to get rid of their Romani population.
Two questions just off what you were discussing. The first one is more kind of just focusing on what you were saying about what you were mentioning about local dynamics and kind of attitudes, and how that then contributes to the level of violence that is enacted towards the Romanian people. How, like, and also I guess you were mentioning that it wasn't much of a surprise to most people because it had been happening for so long. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, was there much of a reaction then? I can't imagine, from the local population when the violence is escalating against Romani people, because they almost seem like it's normal, like it's happened before.
And I think that also helps to explain part of the reason why, when you were in school, when I was in school, we think of the Holocaust as something that affected the Jewish people. We know that 6 million Jews were killed. But for a lot of folks, I don't think there was the same kind of drive to memorialize and remember what happened to the Romani populations throughout Europe, because there's this long history of persecution of Romani populations. And in most cases, it continues after the war ends. So, for instance, in France, where many of the Romani were interned, during the war, there wasn't a systemic campaign of annihilation like there was, say, in Germany or in occupied Poland. However, they're still in camps in 1946, right? And no one's protesting in the streets that the Romani are still in camps in 1946. So I think that's also part of why the memory is different, is because in many states the idea that Romani are career criminals or that they are inherently lesser doesn't go anywhere after the war. And of course, anti-Semitism persists in Europe. So that's also a similarity. But I think the association with constant criminality that still really affects the Romani population today. I just think it makes it, people don't think about it as much.
No, no. And then the second question that I wanted to ask was, uh, much of, well, all of what the Nazis do is very much based on racial purity and racial heritage, and the weird kind of pseudoscience that's based around, or it's kind of the love child of Darwinism and kind of the racial theories that imperialism is kind of bounding around at the time. How, or like, I guess what I'm asking is, how do the Romani people fit into that ideology, which is like, so for argument's sake, again, going back to school, we're very much taught that Nazi ideology classed Jewish people and Eastern Europeans, or Slavs as the Nazis would refer to them as being racially inferior, whatever that means, right? However, how is the genocide against the Romani people explained within that racial pseudoscience?
It's an interesting case study, and I think it works differently. I mean, racialization, I think, works differently with different groups, right? Because ultimately, racism is serving the folks who have power and want to maintain it. So their justifications are going to be different. One of the sort of weird and interesting things about the racial persecution of Romani people during the Nazi era is that someone like Himmler is quite interested in what they're going to call pure blood Aryan Romani people. And so Himmler has this work done to isolate a small population of who he's going to call these pure-blooded Aryan gypsies. They're Sinti and Laleri, he calls them, and he wants to kind of protect them because he sees them as this good sort of population that has its roots in India, and fills their sort of Aryan dreams, right? But in practice, that is not how it works on the ground, right? So he has these weird racial fantasies, but on the ground, populations are racialized already by local officials. And once they're racialized by local officials, and again, this is a process that starts way before World War II, as criminals, as less than, as asocials, as a problem people who are dirty, who spread disease. When local authorities are empowered to solve the gypsy problem, they're not caring who they kill. They're killing anyone who gets labeled as a gypsy. It doesn't matter how pure they are racially. So there's kind of this difference between the ideologies of racialization at the top and how they function, and on the ground during the war, when people are given the power to eliminate their problems, depending on local officials, they're gonna kill who they label as a problem. And there's also these really interesting exceptions that I wrote about in this article, of Muslim communities, really in what the former Ottoman Empire, who stand up and rescue the Romani, who are being slated for deportation to the camps, by saying these are Muslims. They do not fall in the same category, and our community is willing to stand up for them and protect them, which I thought was a really fascinating example of resistance. So there's, and different communities sort of decide we're not interested in killing off the Romani, and other communities are very enthusiastic about it, like in Romania, and Hungary once the Arrow Cross takes over. So it just depends on the local conditions. Anywhere where the Germans come in and directly administer a territory, there is a genocide of the Romani people.
It seems as though the term Gypsy, Romani, however the language is used in the Second World War, is actually almost like a catch-all phrase when it comes to the actual execution of the genocide, because it seems that whoever's on the ground, if they've got a personal grudge, they can be like, well, that person's a gypsy or whatever, and let's just include them. So, and it seems like there's a more of a, as I guess, as as kind of as perturbing as it is, it's almost giving people more of the ability to actually include anybody in this genocide. Like, as in, there's no, it's just almost like a catch-all phrase. Although it does refer to a certain community, when it's being implemented, it's anyone.
I mean, I think in most places, the folks who were put in the category of gypsy or whatever the local word was, that had happened way before the war.
Okay, understood.
So these folks were already stigmatized, and many times in these smaller communities where the genocide is being carried out, it's neighbors saying, "Well, we know that these people are gypsies." But you're right. I mean, certainly that process of labeling, like with any racial group, I think, is not precise, right? And it's not based on anything real. So of course, folks who are going to be stuck in a category are they don't really have any control over that categorization oftentimes, and there's not, those boundaries around that category are quite flexible, and they were flexible before the war and continued to be so after the war too.
Your text also mentions that there are debates amongst historians about regarding what happens towards the Romani people as a genocide or not, or
Mm-hmm.
not. Sorry. What are these arguments for and against? Like, as in, I'm no expert, just from reading what you've written, and also from what we were taught at school. I would very much, and then also I remember we had to do a genocide module at university, which was interesting as much as it was harrowing. But for me, it seems it's quite a clear cut case. However, I'm quite intrigued to find out what are the arguments for and against this, and why also is kind of my question.
Yeah, so I also see it as a clear-cut case. There was genocide. I don't think there's any question about it.
Yeah.
But as late as 2000, Gunter Levy publishes a book from Oxford University Press that argues that it wasn't a genocide because what Romani people were persecuted because of their behavioral traits. Now, I don't understand this, right? Most racial categories have behavioral
Yeah.
ascriptions as part of
Yeah.
a racialized category. So I don't understand how that's not a genocide. But that's as late as 2000 that folks are arguing that what happened to the Romani was different than what happened to the Jews. And I think most of this springs from a debate about the uniqueness of the Holocaust as a Jewish genocide, and that is its sort of primary uniqueness. And so I think there's a way to try to sort of defend that.
Mm.
But I just finished reading a fabulous book on one of these questions, or this particular question. It's called Reign of Ash by Ari Yaskovitz, and he's at Vanderbilt University. And he is talking about kind of the shared experience of the Holocaust for Jews and for Romani in these camps, but they're kind of suffering alongside of one another and often not interacting with one another. And that in the post-war era, with the construction of archives and the construction of foundations and research centers, that the Jewish suffering often becomes the center, right? And Romani suffering kind of is peripheral or an afterthought to the construction of that story. And so I think that's kind of where the debate is rooted in. But just because you have two genocides happening, right, you don't have to put them in a hierarchical comparison, right? They're suffering, right? They're both genocides. They're both incredibly awful and devastating for the people who experience them.
No, definitely. Your mention about the construction of archives and foundations leads me nicely into the next question, which is how then does in the post-war years the inclusion of Romani voices and those who had survived or at least could continue the tales of those who had been victims of the genocide, how does the inclusion of their voices kind of shift that narrative in the post-war years and actually, I guess, demand more attention to what took place to the Romani people?
beginning in the 1960s and the 1970s, Romani activists begin to organize, particularly in places like Germany. They form political activist organizations. They argue for the need for compensation for victims of the war, and they really begin to fight legal battles. And oftentimes they're doing this with the assistance from and cooperation from Jewish Holocaust organizations that begin to recognize the need for this. In the United States, the battle or the beginning of this recognition and this turn really happens when the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum is founded in the United States in the 1980s. And the Romani, led by Ian Hancock and other Romani activists, really argue for a seat at the table and the necessity of including the Romani experience in the Holocaust Memorial Museum in people's consciousness of what happened during the war. So really in the 60s and 70s, there's a working together in many ways of organizations that are commemorating the Jewish Holocaust and an increasing recognition that the Romani genocide needs to be recognized and memorialized as well. And so over time, the political organization, the funding starts to reach a critical mass, which then brings it into the public consciousness. But right, I just taught this last week in my class, and my students didn't really know that the Romani were victims of the Holocaust. So I mean, it's
Yeah.
still not really there.
More of a question in regards to your research. Like, how did you go about the research for this work?
Particular chapter was more me reading all of the historiography than doing on the ground research. So it was more of a review of all of the research that has been done on the Romani genocide during World War II and trying to put it into a succinct summary so that if people wanted to learn more, they would have a good bibliography, a good sense of where to look. So this wasn't really a primary source project in many ways. It was more of a review of the historiography of the genocide. Um, again, so yeah, that's kind of how I went about it. But it was there's a lot, right? And I think there's often like an idea that it's understudied, and I mean, I think to a certain degree it is, but really in the past 10 to 15 years, a ton of work has come out on the Romani genocide, and there is a lot of stuff to read through and try to understand and process if you're interested in the topic. There's a great bibliography I mentioned in the article that kind of just they did this Herculean task of going through and arranging by country and by topic everything that had been written, which is also a great way of highlighting where the holes are, where people need to do more research on the Romani genocide.
No, definitely. Thank you for that. Your the just coming back to the text that you wrote that you were just discussing, like it outlines the aftermath and long-term effects of the Romani genocide, including issues of restitution and recognition. Just dealing with the aftermath on its own at the moment and kind of the long-term effects. Like, I know some of the answers are almost obvious in the question, but what are some of the long-term effects on the Romani people across Europe who are impacted by the genocide?
Certainly going into World War II, many Romani populations, because of all of the racial persecution that I talked about before, they're already a group that suffers from a high degree of poverty. Certainly the widespread internment and persecution, detention of the populations throughout Europe during World War II means further impoverishment, right? So folks who did survive the World War II era are destitute. They're also often not eligible to seek restitution in courts of law in the post-war era. That's beginning to change, um, but it's still difficult. I mean, it's even difficult for Jewish victims initially after the war to claim restitution. There's all of these hoops that they need to jump through, and often, if you think about the ways in which Romanis were persecuted before the war, it often involved taking away their claims to identity, right? Taking away their identification documents, identification and tracking and surveilling of Romani populations is widespread. So Romani have a particular interest in hiding their identities, right? In many cases, from people who want to do bad things to them, right? And so in a system that is very bureaucratic in a post-war era that relies on identification documents, proof, written evidence, it becomes very difficult for them to access the kinds of restitution that the limited kinds of restitution that are available. So, I mean, that's one long-term effect, right? You don't have generational wealth in the Romani populations because there has been a concerted effort for centuries to remove any kind of wealth that they could collect. I mean, just to give a quick example, like in Italy in the 19th century, early 20th century, every time Romani were arrested, often for very petty crimes, they are forced to pay the cost of their own confinement, right? So families who were relatively wealthy, they might have been horse traders, they're repeatedly arrested and repeatedly forced to use their own reserves to pay for their confinement. So, you know, this is before World War II. So I mean that's a huge issue, right? How can you, and then of course you're going to condemn folks for being poor and begging. Well, I mean, you know, how are they supposed to retain any kind of wealth? So that's one issue. And then again, I think there's been, in a way, looking at German history, I think Germany, in some ways, has been exemplary in the ways that they have tried to come to terms with the historical impact of the Holocaust against their Jewish citizens. I don't think there has been the same effort throughout Europe to come to grips with the enormity of the Romani genocide. And in fact, right, in many places, if we look at Hungary today or we look at Italy today, there is a renewed interest in the persecution of Romani populations. And I mean, you know, we're coming off of COVID, and in places like Italy, right, blaming Romani as vectors of disease, it's still there, right? So there hasn't been this historical reckoning, and so it's created a situation in which Romani activists are there. They're fighting. they're trying to get a foothold and to stop the prejudice and the discrimination, and they're working very hard on that. But it's still there, and I don't think there's been the same kind of reckoning. I mean, the EU has spoken a lot and done some concrete things to work against anti-Ziganism in Europe, but there's still a long road to go.
From all of the questions that I've asked, one that I've not asked you yet, and I'm surprised that I didn't put it on the list, which is, are there acts of Romanian resistance against the genocide as it's occurring?
In various countries throughout Europe, many Romani people did join the resistance. Some of them joined the French resistance, for example. So many of them were fighting the Nazis directly. There's also examples of direct uprisings in some of the camps. So there is a story that I think there's some debate about when it happened and how it happened, but an uprising of Romani people in the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp, gypsy family camp, where people did try to fight the their impending elimination. So there's some isolated instances of those kinds of uprisings of folks who the Romani, the Auschwitz camp for Romani in World War II was built by the Romani themselves. So they kind of stuck them there and said, build your own shelters. And so many of them were able to escape before they erected the fences around the camp. So there's those kinds of stories of resistance of people being able to escape into the woods. So, you know, there's so it just, you know, there's a lot of stories and individual tales of resistance to the Nazis and resistance to discrimination through various, you know, violent, nonviolent means throughout the war.
Is there any act of resistance that takes place outside of the confinement? Is there any kind of like retribution against any of, say, Nazi officials or anything like, is, I guess, setting a statement to some degree? As in, is there anything that's almost like a real attack at the heart of what's happening? Or is it very much kind of in the face of the genocide itself that the resistance is taking place?
I would say that the latter is probably true.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
most of the resistance is, you know, in direct response to the attempt to um, marginalize and kill the Romani populations. I can't think of an example off the top of my head. It doesn't mean one doesn't exist of a kind of a direct organized attempt to attack the Nazis proactively. I can't think of an instance, but again, it could be there is one and we just don't know about it yet. But I don't know.
No, no, thank you. I've gotten through all of the questions that I wanted to ask you in relation to the Romani genocide. I have learned a hell of a lot myself, so I'm hoping everyone listening has also learned a hell of a lot. I just wanted to double check, is there anything that you think we've missed out or we should include or something you want to mention?
I don't think so. I mean, one of the things I think is important to remember is that so much depended on local initiative in the Romani genocide, and so much of how, like, the percentage of Romani population that was murdered, it depended on local people on the ground. And so, when we think about the culpability of individuals in genocide, if local officials weren't interested in murdering Romani, the Romani weren't murdered. If they were, they were. And so, it's not something that we can blame on Nazis. We can certainly blame the Nazis. That's not saying we shouldn't. Of course we should. But also, right, there's definitely a level of individual initiative and on the ground organization that goes into this genocide that is very much the choice and at the behest of local officials who are either very enthusiastic about eliminating the Romani population or decide this isn't something that we're going to engage in. And I think it's a valuable thing to think about, in the face of a genocide, individual local people, individuals matter.
Thank you for that. There is just actually one last question that I wanted to clarify with you, which is, as we were talking, you mentioned that uh the Romani people face persecution even in Romania themselves. And just going back to the popular understanding of Gypsies or Romani people in the UK is that Romani is short for Romanian. When we say Romani people, I know you mentioned that it kind of is a catch-all phrase in some manner, but I guess what I'm asking is, how do you define the ethnicity or that group that is Romani? Because I almost short circuited me when you said they're facing persecution in Romania, because for me they're almost, or the popular understanding in the UK is they're almost one and the same.
Right. And actually, I'm so glad that you asked me that question because they are not.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah.
And I think, and especially, when I've been to the UK, I think there is a way in sort of culture that they're conflated.
Yep.
And if you ask a Romanian often, if the Romani are the same, they will not be happy with you. And there's also this idea. I've heard stories of, like, people being brought in to kind of translate for Romanian Roma, and Romanian translators are mistranslating the Romanian Roma because of ethnic and racial prejudice. So those are not the same populations, right? Romani people, the reason they're called Romani people is a linguistic term, right? Their common language and their common linguistic root is Romanus. Many different ethnic groups speak Romanus, but a variation of Romanus. Some of the ethnic groups, like for example in Spain, no longer speak Romanus, but it's a linguistic term, and the culture is completely distinct from Romania. And in fact, in the territories of what are now Romania, Moldavia, and Wallachia, historically, Romani people were enslaved by the majoritarian population until
Wow.
1865. So the two groups are completely linguistically, culturally, ethnically separate from one another, but often confused because of the linguistic
Yeah.
similarity in English between the two terms, but not the same at all.
Okay. Okay, understood. And then in terms of, like, as in you said, there is postulation that they came from India, but before they were in, say, Romania or in that part of the world, I guess it is the assumption they were from India, or is there any other theory about where they originate from?
I think that's the main one, although
Yeah.
I have seen recently some more debate about that particular issue. It's not something that I've studied very closely at this point, but in terms of linguistic roots, and anthropological historical research, that does seem like a likely explanation, that they migrated out of India for reasons unknown fairly early on. I think it's like first century CE, second century CE,
Oh
as
wow.
early as,
Okay.
yeah, so quite a long time ago, and then began. And again, there's been research on whether it's connected to particular populations in places like Iran and the Middle East, that then kind of began to travel westward into the Ottoman Empire, Turkey. There's still groups of Romani people in Turkey today. The Ottomans are relatively benevolent when it comes to the Romani. It's when they hit Central and Western Europe that persecution really ramps up, um, in the, the early modern period. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to, I'm not an expert in the kind of the ancient
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
pieces of the history, but so there's some competing theories that they could be from other places and stem from other kind of ethnic groups.
Okay, no, thank you. That has been absolutely illuminating. As I mentioned, just for myself, let alone everyone else who will eventually listen to this. So I just want to say, obviously, thank you for your time. And thank you for answering those questions, um, with such depth and breadth. Because yeah, I've learned a hell of a lot. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
No, not a problem. I'm glad that you did. I'm always slightly nervous. I'm like, I hope these questions go well. I hope it goes all right. But touch wood, 9 times out of 10, it's been fine. So yeah, no, thank you.
No,
I'm
it's
just
been great. Thank you.